This is the last installment of the sermon series we've been working through during the season of Lent. It's called The Holiness of Hard Things. That series has helped us to really come, correct with our understanding of Lent as a time when we get an opportunity to, realize in so many ways that there's lots of things that are keeping us from being the people that we long to be. And Lent is a time to be able to let that go and to put it in the past, but also to realize that sometimes when we go through hard times, that there's a holiness to that. There's a holiness in it because it helps to refine us. And if we're willing to surrender the outcomes, we can often find out who we are, who we really are, and whose we are as well. And so that's an amazing time. It's been a long season of Lent, and we're coming to the very end of it, the last days. And Palm Sunday is one of those days when we get a chance to really kind of celebrate the fact that Lent is almost over, but there's still some steps to be taken because we are now entering into Holy Week, or as it's sometimes called, the week of Passion for Jesus. Passion meaning that there's some difficulty, right? There's an agony to what Jesus experiences as we journey through Holy Week and then ultimately to the cross. But we also know how the story ends, right? That the tomb that Jesus was buried in is empty. Now, I've been to the Holy Land a bunch of times. I'm getting ready to go back again. And there's a debate. There's always a debate about which site is the site of the tomb, the empty tomb, right? So it's whether it's in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is an ancient site, or if it's this other site that they found that was on the other side of a bus station. I mean, it is now. And there's all kinds of compelling evidence and arguments and everything, but I can tell you one thing that's for certain is that there's no one in those tombs, which is kind of awesome, right? And so to be able to reflect on that is the fact that, that's our story, right? And so we're getting there, but we're not quite there. And this day is a day that we read the story of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, a moment when Jesus comes into the city and does so in a very kind of subversive and extremely important way. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But Jesus comes into Jerusalem, the beginning of Passover, to the waving of palms and people shouting and singing, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And so it's an amazing time. But if you've been around church for any length of time, you probably heard that story at some point. I've preached on the Palm Sunday experience probably over the last 20 some odd years, a lot of times. But there's a part of this story that I've never preached on before, and it comes from Luke's gospel. And we're going to read a little further in the story, and we're going to focus on a moment when Jesus weeps. Like he just pauses in his journey towards the eastern gates of Jerusalem, and he weeps over Jerusalem. Now, it's an important reason why he does that. It's because he can see ahead what is going to happen to the city of Jerusalem, which happens about 40 years, a little less than 40 years after this particular moment that we're going to be reading, when Jerusalem was completely destroyed. The temple was destroyed. And it was a terrible, terrible moment in the history of the Hebrew people. But what I wanted to do before we get there is I want to ask and explore an interesting question. Why do we cry? Like, why does that happen, right? And the interesting thing is when I was just kind of pondering that because perhaps you've known somebody who just doesn't cry. There are people that just don't cry. And scientists have always been confused as to why there are some people that don't cry. And that's actually a study that was done, and Time Magazine did a whole story on it. And they were talking about how this particular study that they focused on really started with that question, like, why don't people cry, right? And then it soon became like a bigger question of like, well, why do we cry to begin with? Where does this come from? We cry for all different kinds of reasons. We cry out of sorrow. We cry out of frustration and anger. We cry sometimes watching TV commercials. I've heard. Some people cry over The Notebook. I did not. I was like, oh, that's nice. Meanwhile, like every female in the room that was with me watching it was just bawling, sobbing. And I'm like, I don't get it. But then I watched the movie The Natural, and at the very end when he's like throwing the baseball with his kid, I'm just like, I'm a mess. So we cry, right, for a particular reason, and there's a history behind like how people have seen this, right? So 150 years ago, Charles Darwin, the father of evolutionary theory, among other things, but he called emotional tears purposeless. Like in terms of evolutionary kind of like what it does for you, right? It's like it doesn't really do anything. It's like a purposeless kind of thing that happens. In the ancient times and in the Old Testament actually as well, it describes it as the heart gets weakened, and then whatever gets weakened in the heart turns to water, and then it has to go somewhere, and so it comes out of tears, because all the tears originated from the heart, right? That's all the emotions and all that. That's what they thought. In the 1600s, this is my favorite one. People believed the heart would heat up, like when you were upset or when you were feeling passion or whatever, and the body would produce water to cool it down. That resulted in tears. So the prevailing theories, because we know where they come from, right? I mean, they come from your tear ducts, and I mean that was discovered like in the 1800s or maybe even earlier than that. But the prevailing theories now suggest that crying has to do with vulnerability and human bonding, because at an early age we learn that when we cry, that people come and comfort us, right? And so, but there's more to it obviously than that. I mean, there's reactions, but some people just don't have that reaction, right? And it doesn't mean that they weren't nurtured or whatever. It just means that they're just different, right? They just don't have that same kind of emotional sort of reaction. But there was an interesting comment that was made by Dr. Michael Trimble. It's a quote that kind of gives us a clue as to why we cry from in the beginning. And he says this: there must have been some point in time evolutionarily when the tear became something that automatically set off empathy and compassion in another. Actually, being able to cry emotionally and being able to respond to that is a very important part of being human. So why am I talking about this? Well, because Jesus stops in the middle of that process of going into Jerusalem, right? And he cries. He has a good cry. And the reason why Jesus is crying is because he realizes that the way that he's about to enter into Jerusalem, or the way that he has entered into Jerusalem, there's a message behind it that some people are going to embrace, but the vast majority of the people are not. In the end, they're going to choose something else. And he sees that the people in Jerusalem are headed on a collision course because they have chosen violence. They've chosen a revolution that is unwinnable in terms of feats of arms and strength and military might and so forth, because they are just outgunned by the Romans. And yet they are continuing because of their desire to take control of the situation. They're continuing to go far away from peace, which is what Jesus is bringing. And so Jesus cries, he weeps over this. And all of this comes down to a very important understanding of Jesus and what that means for you and me, that Jesus is weeping in this particular moment. And it comes down to the incarnation and compassion. That Jesus is embodying what God experiences, right, with us in that particular moment. What we know of Jesus and what we believe, we say that we believe about Jesus, is that Jesus truly embodied what God would say, do, think, act, heal, teach, et cetera, et cetera. And so in that moment when Jesus is weeping, it tells us something about it, right? That even though we may make the wrong choice, and sometimes we do, even though we may choose to not embrace a Jesus that brings peace and reconciliation and can ultimately lead us to life, we will sometimes choose to either create a Jesus or to reject that Jesus in such a way that we are doing something that is exactly the opposite. We are traveling on a path even to our own destruction. And in those moments, God has compassion upon us. That in those moments where we make a choice that is not the right choice, that God is with us, compassionate, weeps over the choice that we have made, but is with us and will not leave us. And so that's what I want to focus on today, our big idea. No matter our choices, God's compassion never wavers. So yeah, come on. Hey, I didn't say it. Well, I said that, but the other stuff I don't. So let's take a look at Luke, okay, chapter 19. And we're going to read a bunch of verses. So I'll teach as I read, and let's dive in, because this is the story of the gospel according to Luke's version of the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. So let's read. After Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. As he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' say, 'The Lord needs it.'" So Jesus' triumphal entry involved planning, right? This wasn't just something that he just decided to do. There was like a plan involved. And Jesus, was essentially, probably the disciples may have felt like he's just told us to go and steal a donkey. That's not what I had in mind today. But there's planning, right? There's like a code word, right? There's a thing that there's this whole process then where Jesus is planning this because he's wanting to go into Jerusalem in a particular way, right? And the disciples have their roles to play in this. And there's this whole process that's ahead of it, right? Because he's wanting to make a point. And it was done to proclaim the nature of God's kingdom. So Jesus is fulfilling a prophecy, essentially. There was a prophecy from Zephaniah where it talks about how your king, your true king, is coming into the city humble and riding on a donkey. And so this contrasts with the way that Pilate, the governor, the provincial governor of Judea, the Roman, right, who eventually presides over Jesus' trial, so to speak. Pilate had already marched into Jerusalem for Passover, riding a huge white horse, surrounded by all of the soldiers, carrying all the banners and the insignia of the Roman Empire. They had ridden into Jerusalem and made their way all through the streets, all the way up to where they would be quartered, right? Where he would take up residence during the Passover, which basically overlooked the temple, right? It was like overlooking the courts of the courtyards of the temple, so they could be keeping an eye on all of the people that were coming in. And so they did that on purpose to show people, like, you better not try something, right? Otherwise, we're going to take care of you. Jesus comes in a completely different way, riding on a donkey, humble, right? But yet there's all these other symbols as well. And So he has palms, which were symbols of revolution, really. They date back all the way to the Maccabean time when Joseph Maccabeus, his name means Joseph the Hammer, who fought off the Syro-Grecian king. I mean, I know this is boring, but for you history buffs, this is like awesome. So this is all post Alexander the Great dividing up his empire and so forth. And this Syro-Grecian king was trying to outlaw Judaism, basically. He was torturing people, tearing their tongues out, forcing them to eat things that would make them unclean. So he was basically trying to wipe out Judaism, and they fought back. And so Judas Maccabeus led a revolt, a revolution, and they cast off the Syro-Grecian king. And so when they celebrated Judas Maccabeus, when he came into the city to cleanse the temple, they celebrated him by waving palms. So it was a sign of nationalism, right, in a lot of ways. So Jesus is having people wave palms and do all this stuff, but yet the way that he comes into the city speaks of something completely different, right? He's not coming to bring an armed revolution. He's coming to bring peace. He's coming to bring a revolution of the heart. That, honestly, would be much more effective than the use of arms. So, at any rate, let's keep going. Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked him, "Why are you untying the colt?" They replied, "The Lord needs it." They brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. As he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came to the place where the road goes down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." Some of the gospel accounts will say Hosanna, right? Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Hosanna is a word that means just save us now. Like save us now. Like we need saving. And so this is, I love this painting actually because I'm really partial to pre-Raphaelite artists. And if you don't wonder what pre-Raphaelite artistry looks like, it looks like that. But it's just kind of amazing. And like one of the stories, it's a donkey leading a colt. I mean, the stories just like we've talked about last week, they just kind of muddled sometimes. But you can kind of see here the sort of pageantry and the pomp and circumstance with the disciples waving palms and people falling down and getting excited. Okay, the shouts of Hosanna and blessed is he were part of the traditional ascent songs, like the songs that people would sing when they were coming into Jerusalem for Passover. Like they were pilgrims, you always went up to Jerusalem, and there was a reason for that, is because Jerusalem was high up. It's already a high spot from all the other places around it. But then once you got into Jerusalem, you had to go up to the temple because the temple loomed over everything. It was on the highest point, Mount Moriah, the famous mountain where Abraham almost sacrificed his son Isaac from the Old Testament, right? And God stopped Abraham from doing that. That was on Mount Moriah, which also is in Islam and Judaism and in ancient Christianity, a belief that was the part of the world that God began to create, right? So that's like that's mythology. So this was a coming out celebration, but it was not the kind that everybody expected. Like Jesus was declaring, like, this is what I came to do. And it was not really what the people in the end wanted, right? They were wanting some kind of revolution. They were wanting something that would overthrow the Romans. They were wanting some kind of armed rebellion, and Jesus didn't come to do that. And so this happens as we keep reading. So some of the Pharisees in the crowd, there's always a Pharisee lurking about just to kind of spoil everybody's fun. Pharisees have been around a long time. They called them Puritans. I'm not going to keep going. That would be rude. All right, some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." "I tell you," he replied, "if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." Which basically, like, this is happening, y'all. Right? This is happening. Then Jesus stops and weeps for Jerusalem, which is a harbinger of other things that are to come. And so let's read that passage. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it. And he said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. So this is a prophecy, and that prophecy is something that could have been changed, right? So Jesus is speaking of what would happen in 70 AD when Rome would besiege Jerusalem and eventually tear all the walls down, tear the temple completely apart, a temple that no one in their right mind in the first century would have believed could be torn apart. The Romans were like, we can do this, and we're going to show you just how powerful we are. We're going to tear everything down except for one wall, and we're going to leave that one wall up to remind you of what we did. And it was horrible. If you ever read Josephus, the siege of Jerusalem, it was a terrible and horrible time. Jesus is seeing that all of the things that they are doing, right? The way that they think, the way that they're sort of, like moving in that direction, a move towards violence, a move against the very things that they should be doing. The leaders, the religious leaders that are basically selling the people that they're supposed to be caring for down the river in exchange for money and power. A Roman Empire that basically could care less about the average person as long as they just keep paying taxes, right? Just keep feeding the machine. And the minute that you don't do that, they're going to come and destroy you, which is exactly what they did. There's a chapel that was built in 1955. This chapel is called Dominus Flevit, which means the God who weeps. This chapel was built on the site of a 5th century Byzantine chapel that existed long before that, but was torn down. But this 5th century Byzantine chapel had been dedicated by a guy named Simon, who gave all of the money to it, to have it built, because he was doing it in memory of his brother and in recompense for all of the sins that he had committed, right? And so he did it on this site, a site where Jesus had wept. The interesting thing about the architecture of this is that if you look at the little spires, those are jars that are the idea is they're collecting the tears of God. And inside, it's a wonderful sight. It's very moving. If you look to the next slide, there's a window like by the altar that looks out over the city of Jerusalem. It's an absolutely beautiful sight. And every time that I've been in it, I'm just reminded of this moment in the story where Jesus weeps. So, what do we do with all this, and how do we figure it out? What's the significance of this for us? Well, it means that even though we make poor choices, right? Even though we may do exactly what these people did, which was, I'm going to do this my way. I'm going to move in this direction because this is what. Not only does it make me feel better, right? Whether it's anger, whether it's hatred, whether it's revenge, whatever it is, or maybe you just want to fulfill your own desires and you want to do the thing that you want to do because you want to have control of all of your outcomes in your future and everything. And so you decide that's what you're going to do, and you make that choice, and then you realize that it was a mistake. You realize that you chose poorly. But in the midst of that, we are not alone, right? The God who weeps over our choices is a God who is with us, a God who is intimate, a God who knows what it's like to feel that sorrow and to also know that on the other side of all of that suffering, on the other side of all of what we might face, there is the possibility of resurrection. And so I have some interesting thoughts about this, right? So the crowds cheering him on were on a path and had made their choice, but God's compassion was with them. And so I've come up with like maybe 3 things I think that'll help us sort of figure all this out. So the questions that we need to ask ourselves. And these are questions that are really, I think, important. And if you want to write them down, that's fine. We have the notes are by the doors as you leave if you want to keep them. Because this is something that I've been reflecting on myself. What choices have we made that we have yet to own up to? Right? Like, I've made choices in my life that, I look back and I'm like, I wish I had done that differently. But so many times what we do is we want to give ourselves a break, right? If it's somebody else, we're just like, somebody says, I wish I'd been, you can't do that. You can't blame yourself. You can't, we want, just forgive, you know that you're forgiven and be at peace. But when it comes to ourselves, I think we struggle with that, right? First of all, it's harder for us to admit that we've done something wrong sometimes. But there are lots of things that maybe we have chosen to do that have led us somewhere that we never expected to be. And just like the prodigal son, sometimes we need to be able to say, I have sinned against God and against whoever, right? I need to go back. Presbyterians don't talk about sin all that much. We talk about sin in a bigger sense, like systemic sin, And that's important because there's a lot of churches that don't ever talk about that. They just keep talking about individual sin. But I think Presbyterians, sometimes we need to take a look at ourselves and look at ourselves in the mirror and say, what have I done that I've not owned up to, that I've not really just owned, right? And then the next question that we go to is, why have we held all that regret inside for so long? And living with regret is like one of the most damaging things that we could do. And the amazing part about this story is that we don't have to live that way. So you messed up. So you made a mistake. So you made a bad choice. Own it. And then let it go. And know that you're forgiven and be at peace. But the first step, right, is to admit that you have a problem. And most of us don't want to do that. And if we do that, then we can say inside, like, then why am I still, if I know that was a mistake, I can't go back and change it. So why am I beating myself up? Why am I living in such regret for so long when I can be set free from this? Because the God who weeps is a God who is with me. A God who weeps knows that I went through some junk. That God wept for me, but that God also knows that on the other side of those tears, there's an empty tomb. And so how do we discover God's compassion again? It's by living each and every day with resurrection hope. Now, we're not to Easter Sunday yet, but resurrection is within spitting distance. You know what I'm saying? And so for us to be able to live with that resurrection hope, oh my gosh. Like waking up every day and knowing that this day was a gift. This new day was a resurrection moment, that you can live differently, that you can live into the hope of God's compassion and know that you are forgiven, to know that you don't have to live in regret, to know that whatever sin, whatever mistake, whatever thing that has happened, that you've done, that you are not going to be held accountable for that any longer because of God's mercy. Now, you may have to deal with some stuff with other people, but in terms of where you stand with God, that God is compassionate, that God is loving, that God is forgiving, that God is all about second chances. And God is still in the resurrection business, y'all, and business is good. So let us remember our main point today as we close. No matter our choices, God's compassion never wavers. Hallelujah. Amen. Let us pray. Good and graceful God, we are so blessed to be able to be here on this Palm Sunday to celebrate, to sing, to pray, to be together, to hear your word proclaimed, God, to know that when we gather together, that your Son's presence is here, that we hold on to that promise that he gave whenever two or more are gathered in my name, I am there. And so we rejoice that we are worshiping in the presence of the risen Christ. And God, I pray that we would hold that resurrection hope in our heart, even as we travel through Holy Week and move towards Easter, that we would hold that hope alive. And we pray all these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. And all God's people said, amen.